So I had a funny moment sitting down last minute to prepare for this talk, as I do, of rereading the summary. What was it that I said I was going to talk about again? Oh, yeah. Okay. Right. I'm going to talk about this thing, about putting products out, about how it's good enough, about how there's a redundant phrasing in the talk description. But I thought to myself, that's not actually a bad thing in this case. That's a pretty good starting point for what I want to get into with this talk, which is the idea of something that you put out into the world is always going to be a better end product from your project than something that you don't put out into the world. And if I had waited until I had a perfectly crafted summary for this talk during the planning meeting, before I had actually said anything, I wouldn't be giving this talk this quarter, because I would have been busy sitting there editing and rephrasing and trying to figure out the best way to present it. And the value of joining in the conversation was higher than the value of having a perfectly crafted, perfectly phrased description. I had intended to go back and edit it again, but still, the principle stands. So there is a tendency among creators, especially perfectionist creators, such as myself, to not just struggle with that perfectionist aspect in terms of being satisfied with your work, but to discard work when you identify perceived imperfections. To say, well, I'm pretty sure this isn't good enough, so clearly it is not valuable. Oh, well, I know I messed this thing up, so now I'm gonna stop. It's a very compelling framework. Well, I can see all of these obvious flaws, so everyone else must see them too. The problem with that, of course, is that you never get any contradictory data points. If you are absolutely certain what someone else's response to your creation will be, to the point where you do not show it to them, you have guaranteed that the only data point you have about their response is, well, here's what I thought it would be. You have learned nothing about the actual experience in the world of other people upon observation or receiving. And the reason I gave this talk now is that we're just coming out of the other side of the holiday season. And some of us have not the money for buying lots of presents and do enjoy making things. So we make things as presents, right? Seems pretty straightforward, which is great right up until you realize that you're trying to make things to give to people with value as presents. And then it can get really difficult, because what was I want to do this thing and make this fun craft has suddenly become an emotionally weighted project. And that can make it a lot harder to put things out into the world. This is a difficult dichotomy. The fact that it's important when giving something to have something to give. It is better to give an imperfect gift than to not give someone that gift, right? I wanted to give someone a Christmas present. If I give them something, I have successfully given someone a Christmas present. If I make 17 or 18 or 19 drafts of it and never finish it, I have failed to fulfill the task, give someone a Christmas present, however much I intended to. If you are always seeking for a perfect result, you will almost always fail to achieve it. And frequently it will undermine your goals, right? But also, you want to make sure that you give something that's good enough, that's high enough quality, that shows people that you put in time and care. And it's very easy to go, well, it's not perfect, so they will think I didn't care, so I shouldn't give it to them. Other people are much less interested in the perfection of your products than you are. Other people do not look at something you have made and go, well, let's find all the ways it's not good enough. And that's hard. That feels very counterintuitive because when I look at it, all I see is the flaws. All I see is the imperfections. They're glaringly obvious. How could you not see them? You who does not do this craft, you who is not looking for what's wrong with it. I picked up a new project this holiday season, as I tend to do every holiday season. I go, oh yeah, that's a thing I thought was interesting 3 months ago. Why not? I picked up a project from the 17 to 1800s, which for those of you who know me should come as no surprise to anyone at all. It is called paper quilling, thus called because it involves rolling little strips of paper traditionally around a quill and then squeezing them and gluing them into interesting positions. And I had an idea for my fiance's mother, which is always a little bit of a, I'm going to make a present for the in-laws. I want to make a good impression here. And she really likes butterflies. And I thought, I will make her a quilled butterfly. It's going to be beautiful. That's a great shape for doing this. It's really straightforward. You got lots of leeway for squiggles and stuff. And then I thought, well, I'll do it on a mirrored backing. That'll look really neat. And then I discovered that when you try and place many little pieces of paper on a mirrored background with glue, you get smears of glue unavoidably. And also that symmetry is the bane of your existence if you are a perfectionist. And so I sat there for many, many tens of hours, curling and twisting and gluing tiny little pieces of paper. And after many, many, many hours, I had this thing. And there were curly coilies. It was on a mirrored background, but all I could see was that there were these smears of glue on it. And there were all these little spots where like one of the pieces of paper had gotten bent slightly and I looked at that and I went, wow. Objectively, this has had tens of hours put into it. This is clearly extensive labor and care. I have made this thing and I don't think it's good enough. I'll ask my family. I'll go check with my community. Because that's a lesson that I learned in high school. And I think we've talked about this at various points before. When I had a tendency during my first ceramics class to squish everything that wasn't perfect. And after the first like month or two of the class, I had exactly no fired and painted and refired finished products. None whatsoever. Because every single thing that I had molded or thrown on a wheel had been not good enough. And so I'd had to scrap it and start over. And I was talking to Mickey, and she told me about a study that was done in a college class where half of the class was told, you will be graded on the perfection of the product at the very end of this class that you produce, how skillfully done it is, how beautiful it is, how well crafted. And the other half of the class was told, you will be graded on the amount of clay you use up. Make stuff. Go make a bunch of stuff. Just do it. Just make things. Whatever. The number of things you make, the amount of clay you use. Go. And at the end of the class, the people who had been obsessing over perfection had markedly worse results and outcomes than the people who had been making things and making things and making things and trying again and doing some more and learning about the process. The doing of the thing has a much bigger effect on your end product, shockingly. But having had this experience in high school and going and doing a bunch of clay things, for the rest of that quarter and ending up with a bunch of finished, glazed, finalized projects, well, I knew pretty firsthand that my perspective on the quality of my work was skewed. And when I showed it to my family, they went, holy shit, that's amazing. Wow, that is insane. That is an incredible amount of detail. What? That's wild. And I went, all right, well, I don't have time to make this again, even if I wanted to. So it has to be good enough. And if the people around me say that it is clearly a quality thing and a labor of love and that it's something she will like, then as much as I go, oh, this isn't good enough, she's going to think poorly of it, she's going to think poorly of me, I should still give it to her. And I gave it to her. And my fiance's mother is not an effusive woman. And she was like, oh, wow, that's very impressive. That's really beautiful. But she also is a very aesthetically minded person. And we were staying with them for a few days. And I noticed the next day, the day after I gave it to her, that it was sitting on her desk directly in front of her mouse, where it was something that she would see every time she sat there. And her desk was not in primary line of sight. She didn't set it on a table in display. Look how nicely I have this up for you. She just had it there because I had successfully made something beautiful that brought her joy. And if I had not pushed through the it's not good enough, she wouldn't have been able to have that joy. So there's a lot of power in still giving people things, in saying, here's a thing I made. Doesn't have to be, here's a thing I made that I'm really proud of. Doesn't have to be, here's a thing I made that is completely free from all flaws. The making of a thing has value. The results of the thing may or may not be good. Let me tell you, some of those finished projects I made at the beginning, like middle section of that pottery class, they were not great. But every time I made something and I came home and I showed my family, they went, whoa, that's really cool. And for the first several projects, I was like, well, but you see, there's this and this and this wrong with it. You know, all this stuff. It's not great. Turns out that doesn't make your art any better. It doesn't make people like your art any better. Disclaimers don't actually help. The disclaimer is, it's a thing I made and I'm a human and humans are imperfect. And thus this thing will be imperfect. And there are actually cultural traditions. In Japan, there is the aesthetic of wabi-sabi, which is the aesthetic of appreciating the imperfect. This thing is better because it is slightly, off kilter, or because it is a little bit asymmetrical. And the Navajo have a mythos structural understanding belief system where they will intentionally weave imperfections into tapestries and rugs that they are weaving, because they believe that weaving was learned from a goddess and only the gods are perfect. So to attempt to create something perfect would be presumptuous, would be to overstep one's bounds. And it also frees people from the, in many cases, crippling pressure of perfection. I have never given someone a crafted item that they didn't like. Not because everything I've made has been perfect, not even because everything I've made has been good, but because I put care into something and then I gave it to someone. And that someone went, wow, someone put care into this for me. That's so cool. I have just been gifted. Someone put care and effort in for me. And also, a lot of the things that I have made and given to people have been really cool and have stayed in circulation. Some of the stuff I made towards the end of that pottery class is still in my parents' dish cupboard a decade and a half later, Eva nodding in the background. There are things that I have made all over my house, all over the houses of my friends and my family, because I like to make things and I like giving gifts as a love language. And people like to be shown care. So part of this is that anything you make and give to someone has the automatic value to them of all of the time and effort and care you put into it. Regardless of the end result, there is the, yay, someone did something for me and they did it on purpose for me. And that's a really nice feeling. That is all full of warm fuzzies, regardless of what the thing made was. And also, we are unreliable narrators as to the quality of our own work, right? I sit there looking at the quilling project going, there are these glaringly obvious flaws and smears, and should I really give this to her? I actually asked my fiance, I said, are you sure that I should give this to her, that she won't be offended by the places where it's not good? And they said, you're very cute and you're very silly. Yes, you should give it to her. No, she won't be offended. The flaws aren't obvious. I can't even see them unless you are directly pointing them out. And even then, they are hard to see. Because from my perspective, I could see here is the thing I was trying to do. And here are all the ways in which I didn't do it successfully. And what other people can see is here is a beautiful end result. They don't have your structure you had in mind when they look at your product. And between the unreliable narration and the skewed perspective that we have on our own work, and the fact that creative acts are inherently subjective, right? Everyone will have a slightly different opinion on what looks good, on what is the correct thing, on how that should be. Which means there is no one proper way that something should look or should be. If I do something and I'm doing bead work, right? And I think I'm grabbing a certain color of beads, and then I get this whole string done, and I realize that I think the color tonality is awful. I had meant to be grabbing a dark blue bead, and instead I was grabbing a navy blue bead, and now it just looks so bad. Someone else might look at that and go, wow, that is a gorgeous color combination. I know a lot of people would have used dark blue maybe, or like teal, and I think that navy blue is just perfect there. What a great choice. This is part of why disclaimers are not valuable. Because at best, a disclaimer says, look, here's an imperfection for you to see. People don't look at your work for flaws. Don't point them out to them. If someone says, oh, what's up with this thing here? Well, then that's a questionable response to receiving a gift. But also, at that point, sure, here's what I had intended. Oh, yeah, that was really difficult. Yup, I grabbed the wrong color there. But you don't have to preface your gift with, so I know this isn't good enough, but you don't have to preface your art with, so I know this isn't good enough, but, because it's good enough. And one of the most valuable strategies I have found for making sure that I put things out there is going, if someone else showed me a piece of their art, what would I think? If someone else showed me a piece of their art with the same imperfections I see here, what would my response be? If someone else because I can be much, much more reasonable and compassionate about other people's art than about my own. Partially because if someone else showed me that piece of art, I wouldn't see the flaws I see in mine. There's so much that we are aware of as crafters, as artists, as creators, that goes into making something, that we have a lot more, we've got a more angled perspective on the ways that things could go wrong or have gone wrong than someone who looks at it and goes, I am seeing this thing being shown. That's an amazing thing. I have also found that even when people do the exact same craft, they will still be delighted and impressed and pleased by what you give them. Even if they do the same craft more skillfully than you do, they will still not see the glaringly obvious flaws, because what they will see is, wow, this person put in time and effort and they made something, and then they made themselves vulnerable by giving it to me, even though I have experience with this. I have never once received a created item from someone and felt anything other than pleasure and gratitude and pride. One of my favorite, like permanent in my box of papers that are important and beloved to keep forever items. It's a little scrap of paper about this big by this big. And on one side of it, drawn in pencil, is a sort of rough sketch of a phone screen with a couple of app symbols drawn on it in little squares. And on the back, like 4 or 5 textured stickers. Because I broke my phone when I was in late high school, early college. And I was having that, I'm a creature of habit, I have undiagnosed severe anxiety, oh geez, I'm really used to having this grounding object and now I just don't anxiety. And my sibling Rage came up to me and said, I made this for you. And he was probably 5 or 6 at the time, maybe 7. And I looked at that and I went, okay, that's amazing. And he said, turn it over. And I turned it over. And she pointed to it and went, look at all these stickers. They're like the ones that were on the back of your phone. Because I had stickers on the back of my phone as sensory fidgets. This is not a beautifully crafted piece of art that was, and it is one of my most precious belongings because it was so well done and they took the time to draw this picture and pick out stickers and put them on there for me. The point is not perfection. The point doesn't have to be perfection. So letting perfection define our endpoint is artificially cutting off the value of our creative acts. Making things and putting them in the world is valuable in its own right. Don't be afraid to make, and don't be afraid to show. Other people want to look at your art with an appreciative eye, not a criticism eye. I say criticism eye because lots of people will assess things critically. That's not the same as criticizing them. Nobody whose opinion is worth listening to cares whether your art is perfect, but they sure care whether your art is there. So that's that.